Hello, dear friends. Good afternoon. Today we continue our lesson on the teachings of the Epistle of Peter, and we will be looking at two topics today. We'll start with Peter's teaching on how Christians ought to live among their fellow Christians, that is, interpersonal relationship among Christians, and also look at what Peter taught on how Christians ought to be good citizens. So we start with Peter's teaching of how Christians ought to live with one another. Now, in Peter's teaching with the early Christians at the time, he taught them how to promote, and not only promote, but to sustain values that would generate good interpersonal relationships. Now, he categorized this message into three parts if you study the message carefully. So we are going to look at three thematic areas that Peter employed in teaching on how Christians ought to live with one another. So he started by addressing the elders, the leaders of the then church. And this is what Peter said. He told the elders to tend the flock of God in their charge, to keep the Christians that God had put them in charge of, to tend them. Now he warned them that they should, in leading the flock, do so willingly without someone forcing them to, not out of grudge or not out of ill will, but out of willful desire. They should do so willingly, and they should be zealous about it. They should be eager, and in the same way, not domineering, not lording it over the early Christians. And they should not do so for shameful gain. So he told them, do it willingly, eagerly, and not domineeringly or for shameful gain, meaning that they ought not to be bossy over the church. Now, he went on to state the reason why they ought to do so, not to do so for shameful gain, but to do so eagerly, willingly, and not domineeringly. The reason was that when they do so, at the appearing of the chief shepherd, who is Christ, they would be rewarded. So he tells them, lead the flock, tend them willingly, eagerly, not domineeringly or for shameful gain. And in doing so, at the appearance of Christ, you will be rewarded. Then he goes on to address the youth, because in the church, once there are leaders, there are followers, and majority of these would be in the youth. And so he addressed them to be subject to the elders. As the elders lead in a servant way, in servant leadership, they also ought to subject themselves, humble themselves to the elders. They should all clothe themselves with humility. Everyone should be humble. And Peter says, he gives them a reason why they have to be humble. He says, this is because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So Peter will say, humble yourselves under the authority of these leaders. Why? Because if you humble yourself, God will be gracious unto you. God will open doors of opportunities for you. But if you are proud, if you rise up and you rebel against these leaders, God will oppose you. And that was a very deep statement. Now, the other part of the message that Peter said was about their general situation at the time. At this point in time, the early Christians were being persecuted by the authorities at that time. Number one, They were being persecuted by the Jewish religious authorities because they were going against the established religious regime of Judaism. And they were deemed also to be going against the Roman government because they were ascribing lordship to a certain Christ. But the Romans knew that their only Lord was Caesar. And so on both fronts, the early Christians were being persecuted, especially the Jews, by their own people and by the Romans. And so in Peter addressing how they ought to live among themselves, he told them one important thing, that cast your burdens upon God because he cares about you. Now you want to ask yourself, these are Christians. So why should Peter tell them to cast their burdens on God because God cares about them? It is because at this point in time, they were likely to be wondering, to be going through their minds and asking themselves, well, does God really care about us? Why? Why are we going through all these problems, all these challenges? Peter told them, God still cares about you. So whatever burden you have, cast it upon God. Pray to God because God cares about you. And then he goes on to tell them something quite instructive concerning the time that they found themselves. Let's not forget, as we have said earlier, that this was a period of great persecution for the early Christians. And so Peter told them, be sober, be watchful, because the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom to devour. The leaders at that time, the civil authority at that time, the Roman government, the Jewish religious leaders were like lions, seeking the early Christians to devour them, to subject them to crude treatment, to persecute them. And so Peter was telling the early disciples, watch the way you live your life. Without denouncing your faith, you ought to be wise. You ought to be careful because around you, you have people waiting to get you and mistreat you, to get you and persecute you. So be careful, be watchful because the devil, like a lion, is walking around, is prowling around, seeking a prey to devour. He goes on and he tells them, even though you are within these times, resist the devil. Resist the devil with the knowledge that other Christians all over the world are suffering the same experience. So as we said earlier, the Christians at that time were all suffering persecution. So Peter was telling them, know that you are not the only ones in this situation. Other Christians are also in that situation, but you have to resist the devil. And so finally he tells them, be strong, because after you have suffered a little while, God will restore you, establish you, and strengthen you. But all these will not come, as I have earlier stated, until they have suffered a little while. And so this is what Peter taught the early Christians on how to live with one another. Let's go through the whole thing again, because as I said earlier, the lessons in the selected epistles of 1 Peter and James are not like the narratives, like the stories we see in the Acts, in the book of Acts, and in the Gospels, and in the Old Testament. These are more doctrinal teachings, and so they are a bit hard to recollect. Therefore, I have created and thematized these teachings into simpler forms in diagrams so that you can easily understand them and apply them, so that you can write easily and you can remember easily as well and give a very good account of it, because like it or not, you would be required to give an account in your exam. So let's go over all that we have learned again. This is a summary, as I've said, of all that we have spoken about. So we start with Peter's teaching on how Christians ought to relate with one another. And as we said, he started by addressing the elders. And then from the elders, he addressed the youth, the followers. And then from there, he addressed their current situation of persecution. So if you know these three areas, when you are writing, you write under these three areas so you don't miss a fact or a point. So what did he tell the elders? He told the elders, tend the flock of God eagerly, willingly, not domineeringly or for shameful gain. Rather, know that when you do so, at the coming of Jesus, the chief shepherd, you will receive a reward from God. And so that is what he told the leaders at the time. And then he went on to the youth. And what did he tell them? Mainly, he told them to subject themselves to the authority of the leaders. He told them to be humble and mentioned two very important things there. But God, when we are humble, will be gracious unto us. God will give us grace. But when we are proud, God will oppose us. Then he goes on to mention the current situation in which the Christians found themselves. What did he say? This is what he says, that they should put all their cares on God, because God is there for them. God cares about them. And he tells them, be sober and be watchful, because the devil, your adversary, your enemy, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom to devour. He told them that they should resist the devil with the knowledge that their fellow Christians were going through the same experience of persecution. So they should know that they were not alone. Then finally, he reassures them that God was going to reward you. God was going to restore you. God was going to strengthen you. God was going to establish you only after you have endured this persecution for a little while. And so when you look at this diagram, it simplifies Peter's teachings on how Christians ought to live with one another. The elders ought to tend the flock of God in their charge. They should do so eagerly, willingly, not domineeringly or for shameful gain. When they do so, at the appearing of Christ the chief shepherd, he would reward them. He advises their youth that they should subject themselves to the authority of the leaders, that they should be humble because God, all of them should clothe themselves in humility. They should be humble because God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Then he talks about the general situation of persecution at the time. He tells them, cast all your cares and all your burdens on God because he's there for you. Be sober and be watchful. Why? The devil, your adversary, your enemy, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom to devour. Resist the devil with the knowledge that your fellow Christians universally were suffering the same experience of persecution. And then, lastly, he told them, endure because there will be a reward. And the reward was that God was going to restore, strengthen, and establish you after you have suffered a little while. My dear friends, what do we learn from this teaching of Peter? So these are the lessons. Number one, we learn that Christian leaders must be servant leaders. If a Christian is a leader in the church, or wherever he or she may find him or herself, especially in the church, that leader must not be a domineering leader, must not lord it over people. A Christian leader must be a servant leader. That is the first thing. Then also we learn that Christians leaders should not lead for the want of materialism, for material wealth. That is not the reason why we ought to lead as Christians. We ought to lead as Christians because we know that our ultimate reward for leadership will come when Christ appears unto us. Also, we learn that all Christians must be humble in order to obtain the grace and mercies of God. There is nothing to be gained in pride. And so when we are Christians, we should know that we should humble ourselves, because when we humble ourselves, God will be gracious unto us. But then when we are proud, as Peter said, God will oppose us. The fourth lesson we learn is that we should trust God to answer us and redeem us even in the face of persecution. The early Christians to whom Peter wrote this letter were being persecuted severely by the authorities of the time. And yet, Peter told them, cast all your cares and burdens unto God, for he cares about you. Whatever we're going through as Christians, God still cares about us. And so we have to trust God that he will restore and redeem us. Number 5, we learn that we must walk wisely, knowing the times, discerning the times. At the time, they were undergoing persecution. Those were not easy times. And so when we find ourselves in whatever situation, we must understand the times of that situation and order our steps according to those times. You must know the circumstance within which we find ourselves and walk wisely. Then lastly, we should learn to endure difficult times because we are hopeful that God will redeem and restore us. In this period of the coronavirus global pandemic, we should hope and still trust in God, even if we may have lost people, family, friends. It doesn't negate the fact that God will redeem us. In whatever circumstance Christians find themselves, they must always know that God will redeem them. There are challenges that we go through when we want to live harmoniously, when we want to live amongst ourselves as Christians. And so we want to look at some of these challenges. Number 1 is ethnocentrism, or tribalism, or ethnicity, or racism. So we have ethnocentrism, although you don't see it on the slides, it's the same as tribalism, it's the same as, or it is similar to ethnicity, tribalism, and even racism. When people think that they are better because of the race they belong to, they are unable to treat all manner of people well and live well within the community of the sons of the faithfuls, within the Christian community. We should know that in Christ, there is no Jew nor Greek, there is no tribe. We are all one in Christ. But that can be a challenge when people become ethnocentric, when people are proud, when they think they are better than other people, we cannot live harmoniously. When they are greedy, when they want everything for themselves, when people are jealous, when people lack scriptural knowledge and they don't even know that they have to live well with other people, regardless of their differences, they can't live. And sometimes people are just prejudiced against other people. They just have fixed ideas about people without knowing them. And so they relate with people on the basis of the perceptions that they have about them. And when we have such prejudiced perceptions among us, we cannot live well with each other. And finally, we look at practical Christian living practices. So if we want to live amongst ourselves well, practically, how do we do so? What are some of the things we can do to show that we are living well amongst ourselves? We have to be kind to one another. We have to be humble one unto another. We have already spoken about that. We have to tolerate one another, regardless of the divergent views we may share. We have to forbear one another. We have to be tolerant with each other. Of course, as we live amongst ourselves, we may hurt or get on the toes or in the nerves of each other. We must learn to forgive ourselves. So we must be kind, we must be humble, we must be tolerant, and we must forgive one another. We go on to the next topic, and that is good citizenship. Peter taught about how the Christians of the time ought to be good citizens. It is interesting that in all the lessons we learn, this is one of the shortest topics that we can learn about. One of the shortest. In 1 Peter 2, verse 13 to 17. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13 to 17. It is interesting that let's put this in proper perspective. As we have said earlier, at the time when Peter was writing this letter to the disciples of that era, they were in a situation of global, universal persecution by the powers that be at the time and by the religious leaders at the time. And so the Christians were likely to be thinking that, listen, we cannot subject ourselves to these authorities that are causing us so much harm because of our faith in Christ. And yet listen to what Peter taught them. So he started by telling them that you must be subject to every human institution. Now that is an interesting contrast. These were the human institutions pestering the lives of these early Christians. And he tells them, be subject to every human institution. Why? Peter says that these institutions are in place to punish evildoers and reward law-abiding citizens. So the institutions were in place for a reason. And so that's why Peter said, be subject to them, because they are put there by God to punish evildoers and to reward law-abiding citizens. Now, Peter said that this is the will of God for Christians. That was amazing considering the times, that God wills that we subject ourselves to human institutions. Now, this is a very interesting part where Peter says, do this for one reason. And the reason was to silence the ignorance of foolish men who think that Christians are against such institutions. Of course, there were people at the time who were ignorant. They were ignorant because they felt that the fact that the Christians professed allegiance to Christ as their Lord meant that they were against Caesar. They were against the emperor. They were ignorant. And Peter use quite a strong word on them that these were foolish, ignorant men. Now, put their ignorance to shame by silence their ignorance, by subjecting yourself to the authorities. Let them know that you are not against these authorities. And so, in order to do so, this is what Peter said: honor all men, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor. If you honor all men, if you love the brotherhood, if you fear God, and if you honor the emperor, you will put to shame the ignorance of these foolish men. You silence their ignorance. And so, as I said, this is one of the shortest lessons in CRS, and this is the end of Peter's teaching. But then, this is not the end of the lesson on good citizenship. How can we be good citizens in our contemporary era? How can we be good citizens? Number one, we must participate in national development activities. Everything about national development must concern us. We must refrain from bribery and corruption. Well, the least said about this, the better. We know what bribery and corruption is, but as Christians, we should stand out and abstain and refrain from bribery and corruption. We must not evade tax. We must pay our taxes in the jobs we do. We must protect and sustain the environment. Now, this is very important. We litter around a lot and we blame the government. In order for us to show that we are good citizens, we must protect and sustain the environment. We must protect state property. It is our responsibility to protect state property, not just abuse them. We must avoid the needless waste of all resources, natural resources, state resources. We must protect state property and not waste them. We must also not condone evil. We must report criminals, people who indulge in evil acts, to the rightful, appropriate authorities to deal with them. Then we must not make derogatory remarks against each other. Now, this is very important because when we make derogatory remarks against each other, we jeopardize the peace of our country. We incite violence. We incite conflict. And good citizens don't act in a manner that would lead to conflict. So we should not make derogatory remarks against each other. We must also do honest job, not engage in illegal jobs, in the sale of drugs, in whatever the state deems illegal. We must not be engaged in those acts as well. In being good citizens, there are things that may go against us, that may prevent us from being these good citizens. So we want to look at some of them. We have materialism. Of course, when people are materialistic and they want everything for themselves, they are going to steal, they are going to indulge in bribery and corruption. So knowing this, we should not let materialism be a part of us. Then also we should avoid discrimination. We should treat people fairly. If we treat people fairly, then we can be good citizens. We must not be greedy. We must not be greedy. We must be selfless, so to speak. We must be hardworking and not lazy. So laziness is one of the things that would stand against us in our quest to be good citizens. Then one dangerous thing is religious dogmas. When people think that, well, they have a certain teaching and their teaching says that they should not take part in communal activity. They should not take part in protecting the state. If you find people like this, they would rarely engage in things that would enhance the state of our nation. They'll rarely be good citizens. And so religious dogmas is one of the things that can hamper our bid to be good citizens. Well, dear friends, with this, where we bring the end With this, we come to the end of our lesson on good citizenship and also on interpersonal relationship among Christians. Well, I want to believe that this lesson has been useful to you. I would encourage you to watch the video as many times as you can, so that it helps you to understand these concepts, which are quite hard to remember, like the narratives that we encounter, as I've already said, in the Gospels, in the Acts of the Apostles, and in the Old Testament. This video is intended to help you, so please like, share and help other people also understand these topics. Subscribe to the channel. Let's help learn. And as I always say, be good, do good, and always do have